Welcome, Rahul Roy, to an episode of Radical Futures. So excited to have you here and to celebrate and talk about your book called The Psychic Lives of Statues Reckoning with the Rubble of Empire. A really brilliant and provocative title of a very provocative book. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for
Uh,
having me.
yeah, of course. And we've met before in case that seeps through these conversations, but we'll focus primarily on your book. You are an academic and a scholar of international relations, gender and sexuality studies, queer theory. At least that's how I imagine the work you do. And you teach at St. Andrews in Scotland. You're a prolific thinker. This is your third book, and it's really timely given our world today and the devastation of Palestine in front of our eyes. And I think even the term rubble felt sort of chilling to read. So your book looks at the contemporary debates around statues, specifically dismantling them, felling them, but also the fervor to build them. And you explore the big controversies, starting with the Road Must Fall movement in South Africa, and then how it sort of reverberated in other places. And then all these debates about race and caste and colonialism erupted or re-erupted or keep erupting. And you sort of zoom in on India, which I feel is some of the meat of the book, and the volatility around figures like Gandhi, Ambedkar, Sardar Patel. I find the book timely, I think, because it positions us within something really unbearable about our current moment. If we take Palestine as a litmus test or a case study, I often wonder, especially when one is in social media and you see these sort of quotations floating around, are we witnessing the end of empire, the rubble of empire and colonialism as they are kind of maddened with savagery and violence? Or are we witnessing birth of a nation, the rise of empire in a new avatar and better, more technological, more cruel? And so I feel like in your book, statues are felled and then they're also built. And I think there's a sort of vertigo that I experience around this. So some of it I was able to understand more through your book, but some of it left me even more kind of lost. So I just want to stop rambling, and I just want to ask you, why statues? What made you hone in on this particular phenomena, our society's relationship to statues?
Thanks, Bhakti, and that's a really wonderful overview of the book. And it's always exciting for me to get a sense of how readers are receiving it and what they make of it. So thank you for that. I guess even if you weren't thinking about statues, in 2020, everybody suddenly woke up to them in the midst of Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was murdered.
Mhm.
So much of the anti-racist, but also the racial supremacist
Mhm.
political contention at that time seemed to be happening around statues. They were sort of lightning rods for discontent in that moment. Um, I started thinking about statues in 2015 when Rhodes Must Fall erupted in South Africa. And I guess I have quite a personal reason for that moment being radicalizing for me in a sense. So readers of the book will know that my graduate education in the UK was funded by a Rhodes Scholarship.
Mm.
Um, Anyone who applies for that scholarship has spent at least a nanosecond thinking about the colonial provenance of the money and what it means to accept it. And I suspect some of us, those of us with any kind of left liberal, anti colonial pretensions, tell ourselves this story about why it's okay to take the money. And the story usually goes something like, I will use the money to do good, subversive, politically progressive things, right?
Yeah.
So I do that. We all do that. Multiple generations of us have done this. And then in 2015, this movement erupts. And it's for me personally, it was a moment of elation that, here was a critical mass of people raising these uncomfortable questions that perhaps had occurred to many of us as
Mhm.
individuals, but in a sort of individualistic, quietistic mode. And here was a big public mobilization around those questions. But it was also a moment of profound embarrassment for me because I felt like why had it taken so long for this to happen? Why hadn't earlier generations of
Yeah.
not just Rhodes scholars, but us in the academy mobilized in this way, on this scale? And of course, we had in different ways. I mean, decolonization was in the air.
Hmm.
People were talking about it. But in the particular institutional sites that I was located in, and in the communities that I was part of, this felt like a seismic moment.
Mm.
I wrote something kind of short in a blog post basically in 2015, and I was trying to think through some of these issues. And then a couple of years, or actually a few months later, a movement called Gandhi Must Fall erupts in Ghana.
Hmm.
And Gandhi statues become the sort of center of contention. And again, it's not the first time that Gandhi has been protested against, but there was something interesting about why this was happening now, and
Yeah.
also how anti colonial figures like Gandhi were as much in contention as colonial figures like Rhodes or Churchill
Sure.
or Colston or what have you. So that was really interesting too.
Yeah. Why though? You keep saying it was interesting that was happening now, and then
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand why. Why then?
Hmm.
What is the confluence of things that is, as you say, there are generations of Rhodes scholars or people studying history, studying whatever, in colonial countries, diasporas, or however you want to refer to them. So what was in that moment?
Yeah. When it comes to Rhodes and Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall and the general
Mm.
fallist moment, I think a lot of this had to do with the death of Mandela, which enabled the opening up, the asking of a whole set of questions around the Mandela legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way I read Rhodes Must Fall and Fallism is it's not just a critique of white supremacism and the enduring legacies and afterlives of apartheid. It's also an argument with the Mandela generation about why it didn't do more to dismantle those legacies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I looked at this from the UK vantage point, particularly, where when arguments were made against Rhodes, the most common response from British liberal elites was to say, well, but Mandela obviously forgave
Help it.
him.
Yeah.
Look at things like the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, which is
Right.
living embodiment of this desire for reconciliation, the desire to move on, etc., etc. So
Mm.
Mandela was used as a kind of get out of jail card by
Yeah.
these white liberal elites.
Yeah.
The moment you look at South Africa, you realize how, and I'm not an expert on South African politics, but even somebody like me could see that the Mandela legacy was so fiercely contested,
Mm-hmm.
especially by younger generations of poor Black South Africans who were engaged in this massive conversation about what that legacy means, how much of it has been progressive, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my sense of why the
Sure.
fallism erupted when it did.
Mm-hmm.
With
Yeah.
Gandhi, I think again, it's an interesting question. Why now, right? Many of the critiques are very well known and were articulated in his own lifetime. And that I read as the strength of three social movements that I think became particularly pronounced in this moment we're inhabiting. One is, of course, decolonization movements in the African Academy, of which the
Yeah.
Fallist movements are a good example. One is the sort of Afro-pessimist discourse that came from the US and North America, which focused on the way in which black and the salient fault line in racial politics is
Mm-hmm.
black versus non-black,
Yeah.
not white versus politically black.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the third was the growing global prominence of the Dalit movement,
Yeah.
which is truly a global movement now.
Sure.
And I felt like these three movements, even though they are in many ways incommensurable and have all their differences with each other and often don't converse with each other, I sort
Mm-hmm.
of imagine them as three kind of tectonic plates that bump up against each other in this moment. And Gandhi becomes one of the points of convergence around which their critique
Mm-hmm.
meets.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. No, all really important kind of connections to make generally. And I think one of the things that your book reminded me of was even before the fallist movements, there had been a lot of debates around monuments and things like that. I remember writing some short thing for called "Rage Against the Monuments," which was to do with the artifacts in Mali and all the desecration
Mm,
happened there. And then again, like when things just went so bad in Syria, and then all the kind of monuments and statues and these pillars and stuff like that were destroyed near Palmyra and places like that.
mm,
So what the reason I was thinking about that, or I remember that using the word rage, of course I was punning with Rage Against the Machine or whatever, but
mm,
then that term came back because you are offering this arsenal of vocabulary, psychic, libidinal, phallic, and so on and so forth. And of course, we know every city has its penises. My first encounter was Oslo's Vigeland Park. I don't know if you've been there. I mean, it is it is just a phallus. It's not even trying to be anything else. And then I started to think that the more colonial the city, the more phalluses they have, like the Eiffel Tower or the obelisk in Paris, or like the Shard or
mm.
Cleopatra's Needle in London, and so on. So anyway, I was just wondering, what are you doing with that language? The language of psychic, libidinal,
Mm.
all that sort of psychological stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So one question that occurred to me, and I think many people were asking, is how can an apparently inanimate object like a statue arouse so much fervor and affect, both on the part of those attacking it and those seeking to preserve it in some
Yeah.
sense? What is the source of this affective attachment, this feeling, right? Why do
Yeah.
we care? And it seemed to me, so I sort of started from this ordinary common sense, the ordinary observation that statues are phallic objects. And I wanted to take that seriously and think
Yeah.
about it a bit more and go beyond the obvious stuff of the shape or the fact that they disproportionately depict men in the public sphere. I mean, all of that I think goes some way towards explaining why we think of them as phallic objects.
Hmm.
And the two features that I kind of fastened on is first, there's something aggressive about statues because they enter our sightlines without permission, right?
Yeah.
So there's something non-consensual about them. And the
Yeah.
only comparison I can think of to that is public commercial billboards, advertisements that just assault us without us giving permission. It's
Hmm.
different from picking up a book or going to the cinema to watch a film or going to a museum. There's an act of volition there
Absolutely.
where the viewer is prepared to engage with something. So statues don't do that. And that's the source of their power, right? The fact that they come into our consciousness without warning, without permission.
Yeah.
But this exposure in the public sphere is also what makes them vulnerable to attack,
Absolutely.
to reinscription. So
Hmm.
there's a peculiar combination of aggression and vulnerability. And it
Hmm.
struck me that the phallus is like this. It is this both this aggressive but vulnerable thing, which then becomes a sort of node around which feelings coalesce. And that's sort of what I wanted to capture with this language of the psychic and the libidinal. And so the book is not like listeners might think, oh, this is a book about psychoanalysis. The psychoanalytic apparatus is actually quite sparse, but
Yeah.
what I'm trying to tap into are these intuitive feelings, and I'm trying to sort of unpack them and make sense of them and
Mhm.
elaborate on them.
No, I love that, and I loved reading the part about the lack of consent, or the sort of non-consensual, the type of assault and the emotions that it spurs. And then at some point you also say that sometimes you kind of can go around and never even notice. Like
Yeah,
it could also be totally banalized as well
yeah,
at the same time. But I think because of those many contesting feelings, I think it's great that you at least end up with this lexicon of emotions or affect, or however you want to describe it. And I think it's a light touch, so I wouldn't say that that I suddenly got sucked into some huge psychoanalytic dense theory that maybe one wouldn't grapple with. I think it's a light touch, but it's important, so I'm glad you did that. I wanna start talking about my favorite topic, universities, and why are they so horrible. And we are just living the worst moment of academia, and we are all somewhat implicated in it. Even fighting against it feels part of preserving something. I don't know. I just have so much ambivalence, so much anger against the way universities are behaving in the US, but you could maybe tell us a bit about the UK as well.
Mm.
Um, what is the relationship between universities and statues? And generally, any rant you have about the universities, I encourage you.
Oh, wow. Don't give me too much of a leash here. I mean,
Yeah,
I think what makes universities particularly infuriating is the way they set themselves up as a space, as utopian spaces, as spaces for free thought and creativity and even liberation, right? We are the best humanistic story about the university is that this is the place that will teach us what it means to be truly human.
yeah,
It's a big mandate, and at its best maybe universities can, I don't know if they've ever done that, but that's the horizon that those of us who inhabit these institutions remind ourselves of when we wake up in the morning as a way of motivating ourselves to do what we do. What's the reality? The reality always falls short. And I think this is particularly infuriating in institutions that set these high moral horizons. I imagine, I've never worked in a company before, but I imagine that working in a company that also engages in this kind of doublespeak is less gaslighting because
I know.
everybody knows that a company exists to make a profit for its
Yeah,
shareholders. Universities claim to be something else, but the reality is that they are glorified property portfolios. They are,
really.
there are all kinds of things in this moment. They are producing technologies that actually cause death. If we think about the implication of the university in the academic military industrial complex, as some have called it,
Yeah.
we have universities that are actually laboratories of technologies of death. Their investments, and BDS has been relentlessly focused on this, but their investments store up companies that are implicated in occupation, genocide, violence, and so forth. And they are also, in this moment, actively cracking down on the very commitments that they professed to encourage and inculcate and
Yeah.
incubate. The book was written between these two peculiar bookends, right?
Mm,
So I started thinking and writing episodically in 2015, but I really seriously thought there was a book in this project in 2020, in the at the height of the Black Lives Matter moment, which is also the moment you remember when all these institutions were falling
yeah.
over each other to proclaim their commitment to decolonization, Black Lives Matter, reckoning with the past, all those reports that were commissioned about implication in slavery and colonialism, and the obligations that would follow from that.
Hmm.
And then the book is sort of finished in this ongoing moment of genocide in Gaza, when those very same institutions have rolled back on so many of
Absolutely.
those commitments.
Hmm.
Second Trump administration, the attack on DEI, and also on decolonization itself. So
Yeah.
in 2020, I was writing pieces that were fed up of decolonization talk because they were so shallow and they were so obviously insincere. In
Hmm.
2023 onwards, I found myself defending decolonization,
Of course.
defending these commitments because they were being attacked by the right and the far right as
Mhm.
anti Semitic, as genocidal, these histrionic sort of attacks on decolonization.
Yeah. So bad. But do you think it's as bad in the UK as is in the US? I mean, I know primarily the US scene, and I just it is an absolute horror show because they have also come together with border regimes. The ICE kidnappings and disappearances, and basically these are terrorist militias masked and all this, and they go around doing this stuff. And I know everywhere is not that bad, but it's a cusp always of something, right? So, do you, as someone who is in the UK, or maybe you're a little bit away in Scotland, what's your sense?
Yeah, so it. I think your question requires us to think about the relationship between the far right, the right, and the center, the
Yeah,
centrists who call
yeah.
themselves the left, but are not the left by any
I
stretch of
hate them so
imagination.
much.
So, I mean, the Labour Party in the UK is the equivalent of the dinosaurs of the Democratic Party, the
Mhm,
centrists, who are in this current moment attacking Zoran Mamdani despite, the fantastic victory. I mean, this is a very interesting moment because those centrists have outed themselves and are basically, despite his stunning organizational success in the primary,
mhm,
are revealing how out of touch they are. So the UK is ruled by a Labour government that is like those democratic centrist voices. But perhaps even worse than that, it is so anxious about the threat that the Reform Party under Nigel Farage poses that it's as if Reform was already in power because we have a Labour Party that is more responsive to the reform agenda than anything else.
mhm.
And this manifests in debates around migration, immigration, um, let alone refugees and asylum seekers. I mean, that's where this conversation gets truly unhinged.
Yeah,
But also around disability benefits, around gender and sexuality, the discourse around transness and
yeah.
TERFs in the UK
Whatever.
is its own very peculiar thing. Um, so to me, it doesn't it all. I don't see the UK as being in a better position than the US
Mhm,
because despite being ruled by a Labour government, this is the kind of Labour government we have. These are the sorts of agendas that it is responsive to.
mhm.
And the US has a sort of magnetic effect, right?
Yeah,
The US politics is it's like this black hole that kind of sucks other things into it.
yeah.
It's the force of its gravity is inescapable, particularly for a country like the UK, which imagines itself as a kind of bridge between the US and Europe.
Mhm.
Not anymore, because I don't think the UK has much credibility in Europe. So, all that to say, I don't think the picture is that much
Yeah.
better
Mm,
here, despite us being ruled by a nominally
right.
left,
That
centrist, whatever you want to call it, government.
so tragic. Just absolutely, absolutely tragic. But let's move to the other imperial power, which is the meat of your book, which is India, which is whatever they are. At least they want to position themselves at some kind of an imperial point, and their alliances are, of course, with the U.S. and Israel and so on and so forth. And then there is also the massive diaspora that does a whole bunch of damage. And within that, your intervention on race and caste is, of course, really, really appreciated. And to return to the statues thing, because we moved away from that slightly,
Yeah,
is that in India, we are seeing the reverse. We're seeing a frenzy around building statues, and the figures of Gandhi, Ambedkar, Vallabhbhai Patel are all kind of in this constant constellation, moving and shifting and volatile, resurrected, felled. And it's just like almost, you know, chaotic and confusing, but at the same time, it's like this one line of Hindutva and upper caste, Brahminical, nation building type of stuff going on too. So, can you say a little bit about this frenzy around building statues?
mm. So, the statue wars in India, if we can use that phrase, have been going on for much longer, right? This is a
Yeah,
phenomenon that's been unfolding over
totally.
several decades. And it's a story that Kajri Jain tells very well in her book, Gods in the Time of Democracy, which I have tried to build on. Um, and she traces the origins of this phenomenon to the moment in the late 19th century when British colonial governmentality, through the census and through, very limited franchise that allows elections to provincial assemblies,
Hmm.
communities, Indian communities, become very conscious of themselves as communities, as Hindu, as Muslim, as Dalit, of the power of numbers and so forth. And one way, she argues, in which they express themselves as communities in the public domain is through the visual, through practices centered around icons.
Yeah.
Now, some of this has to do with temples in particular and religious icons. sometimes brought out in processions like Ganapati Utsav in Maharashtra or Durga Puja in West Bengal. Um,
And the
but over
culture of
time,
darshan, as you call
and
it, there's no word
exactly,
for it in English almost. I
there
don't know.
isn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
the exchange of the gaze with the god, which is the most, I guess, the most iconic moment in, I shouldn't use the word iconic to talk about icons, but the most significant moment in worship. And this also manifests itself in the building of statues, which, as objects, are ways of claiming space, quite literally, in the public domain, but also asserting identity, asserting pride in a particular community, in its history, in its mythology, in its icons. And of course, the Dalit movement does this on an epic scale from the 1960s onwards with statues of Ambedkar, of whom there are tens of thousands all over the country, probably the most viral statue building phenomenon anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
What I try and pick up in the book is the Hindu right response to this, particularly in the last 10 years or so. And I focus in particular on this tallest statue in the world at the time that we are speaking, which stands in the state of Gujarat, which is Modi's home state. It's a statue of Patel, who many people will know is the first Home Minister of India, very much remembered for forging the Indian Union by persuading, coercing, cajoling all of these princely states to join the new state.
Mission, yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting for me is the statue is built on the site of the Narmada Dam, which
Mhm.
again people might be familiar is the site of one of the most epic struggles against
Yeah.
big dam development uh, anywhere in the world, but particularly in India. And that's important because when the anti-Narmada Dam agitation picked up, the response from the pro-dam lobby, especially in Gujarat, was to say this is anti-Gujarati politics, right? So, in a way, that struggle, I, I argue, following many other observers of Gujarat, gave us the playbook for authoritarian populism, which Modi then picked up as Chief Minister of Gujarat and then scaled up to the national level. So I see it as a kind of ground zero for the sort of authoritarian
Totally.
populist politics that we are struggling against on a national scale.
Hmm.
Then, of course, you put this in international perspective, and as you said, yes, he's a kind of I would call him a I would call this Indian regime a sub-imperial player.
Sure.
uh, I think they would like to think that they are extremely important and consequential and Vishwaguru and all of that discourse, teacher of the world. But
Yeah.
there is absolutely no exercise of any kind of global responsibility on the part of this state at the moment.
Mm.
On all the big global questions of the day, especially Palestine, their position has been heinous, let alone responsible or neutral or non-aligned or any of
Yeah.
the old speak. So that's the moment we inhabit. And I think the statues and the symbols and the cultural politics of the Hindu right play a very important role because here I turn to Du Bois and his idea of the psychic wage
Yeah.
that he argued was dispersed to white workers in the South in a way that made them feel like that their whiteness trumped their class position. And so
Mm.
effectively they feel affectively attached to the white planter class rather than to the black working class with whom they have much more in common. And I think we see something similar underway in India, where the Sangh Parivar, the family of Hindu right organizations, has been over many years trying to co-opt subordinate caste groups into their electoral fold. And the
Painful.
way they do this is by projecting Muslims as the great existential other.
Hmm.
And the cultural symbols are a way of inculcating a sense of Hindu ownership of the land, Hindu dominance, it's a way of throwing crumbs to the Hindu working classes, the
Yeah.
subordinate castes, and of giving them this psychic feeling, to refer again to the title, that they are in charge, even though in class and materialist terms, their position is in no way improved from
Yeah.
what it has been.
Yeah. Absolutely. Gosh, it's such a painful phenomena to behold, and it's interesting because, like, statues in some way is such a, there's something so fundamentally Christian about building these statues, these heroic figures or whatever it is, or having them in public places. And then Hindus are the other group where just like love idols and statues, and bigger the better, bigger the more, all of this kind of stuff. And within that, somewhere, I guess I do wonder about like the Buddha statues, where
Mm,
where do they proliferate and lie? But that's a different kind. That's a whole other conversation. But let's try to unpack, while we're on the topic, the Gandhi the Gandhi question, right?
yeah.
And what do you think in your book? What are you trying to say about this contested legacy of Gandhi in India, and then also the world, obviously? And in this case, you're writing specifically about Ghana and South Africa, where his statue was very much contested.
Yeah. So the starting point for thinking about this is, the government of India has this habit of gifting statues of Gandhi to countries all over the world, particularly where they want to make a big splash in terms of investment or presence. So typically there will be funding for a big convention center, typically named after Gandhi, and a bust or a statue of him, or some kind of investment. It's a way of signifying Indian presence and expanding Indian presence on the global stage.
Yeah.
The peculiar thing is that these gifts are often very badly received, particularly in Africa. So the protests against Gandhi statues have been vociferous in South Africa, in Ghana, in Malawi. And the arguments the protesters raise, and maybe other places as well, but these are the ones that I tracked. The arguments the protesters raise are, why are you building a statue of somebody who was racist towards Black South Africans in the 2 decades that he was in this country? And, this recent biography by Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Bahed
Yeah.
provides a lot of intellectual backbone to that kind of critique. Then there's the argument, which is now newly sort of outside of India and outside of South Asia and outside of Dalit circles, people are increasingly aware of Gandhi's position on caste, the patronizing attitude towards Dalit upliftment,
Hmm.
the arguments with Ambedkar. All of these things are now much better known globally, including in these African countries. So that argument has come up as well. And then there's the disquiet around Gandhi's sexual and gender politics,
Hmm.
which, he writes about very openly in his so-called experiments with celibacy. But I think in an age of Me Too and grooming and sexual predators, and all of these things have been talked about much more.
Yeah.
We do cast a sort of revisionist gaze on these guru figures,
Yeah, much
including in
needed.
politics. Yeah.
Hmm.
So all of that, I think, has come together to account for this, I guess, revisionist take on
Yeah.
Gandhi from the perspective of radical left movements.
Hmm.
But what's peculiar is that the Hindu right in India also hates Gandhi and always has. I mean, we can't forget that he was assassinated by a figure in the Hindu right, Nathuram Godse, who was very much inspired by Savarkar, who is the sort of intellectual godfather, if you like, of the contemporary Hindu right. So here is this ideological dispensation which attacks Gandhi relentlessly at home. All you have to do is to look on Twitter on the anniversary of Gandhi's assassination, and all of this comes spilling out every year. At the same time as they're gifting Gandhi statues abroad in order to position themselves as,
Yeah.
a civilization, a state that is committed to nonviolence, ahimsa, this benign presence on the global
Mhm.
stage.
Yeah,
It's this weird two-level game that they're playing. And what
totally.
I try to do in the chapter is to try and connect these things up. And the way to connect them up is to focus on what's happening to Gandhi statues. I find
Yeah.
that a kind of useful terrain on which to talk about all of these things that are happening at the same time.
Hmm. So you're saying export Gandhi, but at home revere Nathuram Godse, the killer of Gandhi,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Yeah.
exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
It's
the
so
export
crazy.
works only so long as people are unaware of what's happening
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I see our job as translators or interlocutors
Mhm.
or whatever you want to call what we do, as one of connecting up those
Yeah,
stories and exposing their contradictions, and perhaps in doing that, depriving this ideological formation of its symbolic power and
yeah,
its,
yeah.
calling them out, basically.
Absolutely. And I think like places like South Africa, Ghana take up a lot of space when we're talking about the African continent. And if we're talking about this sort of Anglophone British colonial connection and the Gandhi statues within that, I think we do pay attention to their opposition to it. But then there are the ones that, I taught for a couple of years at the University of Nairobi, and nobody cares about the Gandhi statue there.
Mm.
It's good to go, not up for debate. And there's also a sort of nonchalance around it. But I think anything that happens in South Africa tends to reverberate differently, and good for them. I think it's good
Yeah,
good to
yeah.
have that. And connected to Gandhi, of course, and also Vallabhai Patel. I mean, all this converges in Gujarat, and you have a great chapter where you take a trip to Gujarat, to the Statue of Unity, and which faces, or rather has a view to the Sardar Sarovar Dam. And I found this to be such a fascinating chapter, and you should maybe share a little bit about your trip. Well, how was it? What did you find?
Yeah. So, I think that might be the longest chapter in the book because the whole thing blew my mind, and I just
Yeah,
wanted to capture it for people because,
yeah,
it's actually not heavily visited. One of the first things I learned was, I remember speaking to a cab driver who was like, hardly any international tourists come to this place. So I
so who
said,
goes there then?
who goes there? It's mostly people from Vadodara, Ahmedabad, Surat,
Yeah,
neighboring Gujarati cities who want a weekend out in the countryside, which I'm putting in heavy scare quotes
yeah.
because if you see what they've done to the place, it this is, for context, an ecologically fragile place. Uh, and they claim to be doing so. Let me rewind a bit. There's a dam and there's a statue, but the statue stands at the heart of this ensemble of tourist infrastructure. It's
My
sort of
God.
like a mini city with, 10, 20. I've lost count of how many tourist attractions there are.
Hmm.
Um, Everything is called ekta or unity. Unity this, ekta that. Ekta being the word for unity, right? So it's all about dispensing an ideological message of Sardar Patel as the figure that unified us. This is a place for tourism, adventure, leisure, but also history teaching. It's a place
Hmm.
of pedagogy. It's a place of national integration in the Hindu rights vision of how this should unfold.
Yeah.
It's also ugly as hell because they've paved large sections of the land. It feels a bit like an urban park in the sort of PWD style, which you might be familiar with. Public Works Department has a particular aesthetic. It's
Wow.
that on speed. It's the scale and of
Yeah.
course, in all of this, Adivasi life has been completely uprooted, displacement by the dam in the first place, but also by the statue.
Hmm.
Many of those Adivasi communities have been complaining relentlessly about the loss of land, the shoddiness of the resettlement facilities they've been given. Of course, many of them are forced to work in this new tourist infrastructure, typically in very low paying jobs. So, one of the claims that the government made was, oh, this will be a job creation exercise. Look how many jobs we are creating. Most of the high paying jobs go to outsiders from the region,
Hmm.
and you have Adivasi labor conscripted into the most menial
Of
work.
course.
So it's a classic example of the proletarianization of Adivasis, but also the museumization. So there are these museums of Adivasi life as if they no longer exist. Their way of life is basically put into glass cases and displayed for
Absurd.
tourists. And so I make this claim that this is a kind of settler colonialism because if we think of settler colonialism as the elimination of the native and understand elimination as proceeding in multiple ways, killing is one, but also assimilation into the dominant society or museumization, and then the importing of all these people from outside the region. It is a kind of settler colonialism
Absolutely.
unfolding in the post-colonial state,
Yeah.
which is an idea that we've typically applied to the northeastern states, maybe to Kashmir, to the peripheries, if you like. But
Hmm.
Gujarat is the heartland of
Absolutely.
Hindu right politics, and I think it's happening right there in a really
Hmm.
troubling way.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm trying to talk about in the
Hmm.
chapter. And I think the statue is a sideshow. The statue is
Yeah.
this giant, shiny, distracting object that we are meant to focus on while taking our attention away from all of these long-running processes of extraction of settler colonial capitalism, which
Yeah.
is the story of India shining. It's the
Yeah.
story of the country. It's the story also of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and Orissa and all
Yeah.
of these sites of resource extraction that are
Hmm.
also the most intense sites of political antagonism, violence, political persecution that are underway today.
Yeah.
And
It's
the
kind of
final thing I would say is I was doing this trip in the middle of between COVID waves. So it
yeah.
was a very strange time. We were told that a wave had ended, travel had opened up again, but nobody was really sure how
Mm.
confident they could be. So it was kind of a strange time to do field work. And I also got COVID while doing this
Oh
trip. And
gosh.
then,
Okay.
but
Sorry.
fortunately, it was the less virulent
Yeah.
strain that came later. So it was a dystopian trip in all senses
Wow.
of the word.
My gosh. So crazy. I mean, India has gone so out of it's just like extraplanetary now, these all these sort of forces. I lived as a child for many years in Ahmedabad, and one of my favorite things was to go to Sabarmati ashram, and like people would visit, and I'd be like, this is Gandhi's whatever spool, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I have this kind of sweetness around that, but now it's like jacked up to this violence and extremity. It's really
Yeah.
super depressing. Of course, my nostalgia is also the like a childhood innocence thing. Probably it was bad then too, but I do think we're at a particularly ghastly place at this point. It's
I haven't been to Sabarmati Ashram, but I believe it has also recently undergone a makeover in this
oh gosh.
similarly, showcase for tourism style. And I believe also that the architect is the same guy who has redesigned Central New Delhi, the Central Vista project, which is
Oh,
another
okay.
one of these grandiose
Huh.
architectural schemes that Modi pursued in the middle of COVID, calling it essential work.
Yeah, of course.
So,
Awful.
yeah.
Let's get to your final sort of arguments, which are about the pitfalls of decolonization. And you seem to be tying, quite a lot of ideas from the rest of the book in there. And I think you bring in Fanon, who we here are actively celebrating. Franz Fanon would be 100 years old today had he not been taken so quickly at a young age of 36, and one like a few months before Algeria's independence. So and I was thinking that you've written so much, you've taught so much, and you've surely been thinking about decolonization for a while, and you've probably read Fanon and have been thinking about Fanon for a while. So why now? Like, what are you trying to tackle now with this, with yes, decolonization is extremely important right now. I mean, it has consistently been important for me, trying to shut out the noise of kind of academic battles on it, but and Fanon as well. But currently, even more intense resurgence around that. And within that, do you know why you return to those concepts, to Fanon and so on?
Mm. I mean, the short answer to your question, and there's a longer answer as well. The short answer is that the movements themselves were reading Fanon quite closely and thinking about him. So within the Fallist
Absolutely.
movements. Yeah, so you had to engage with that. And they had very interesting readings of Fanon, particularly the feminist and queer strands of
I agree.
Fallism,
So
which
good.
were battling with the more masculinist tendencies within the movements. And
Hmm.
some of that battle was an argument over how Fanon should be read and interpreted,
Yeah.
where they were arguing that a particularly masculinist, misogynistic reading of Fanon has been so central to certain strands of African anti-colonial politics, and
Yeah.
they were contesting that. And I find that Black feminist reading of Fanon really interesting and provocative and productive. It's also interesting because they don't read Fanon with this reverence that, some people, it's a very common. I think one of the problems with the kind of close canonical reading that we encourage in political theory and maybe literary studies, I'm less familiar, but certainly political theorists
Hmm.
tend to canonize their favorite thinkers. And here I'm making a comparison with so part of what troubles me about that canonization is that once you've anointed somebody and put them up on a pedestal, then different political projects think that the way to legitimate that project is to capture that idol and to press them into service.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I began to see is the Hindu right appropriating decolonial icons like
Hmm.
Fanon, like Nagugi, like Achebe. And I was really intrigued by that capture.
Hmm.
Now you can explain it by saying they see that these figures are hegemonic and they want a piece of them as a way of legitimating what they do. And of course, Fanon has been subject to that kind of treatment from the time he died,
Absolutely.
right, into the moment we're in. And then I began to notice different attempts to do this. I mean, for a long time, Marxist readers of Fanon have been very critical of Homi Bhabha's psychoanalytic take. There's a huge literature around that.
Hmm.
But I was also seeing, for example, Adam Schatz's new biography of Fanon, which I've reviewed elsewhere. I read it was very peculiar to me how in his hands Fanon, he bifurcates the political Fanon from the psychoanalytic Fanon. He
Hmm.
clearly prefers the psychoanalytic Fanon, and he gives us this teleological reading as though the immature, politically impetuous Fanon became this mature psychoanalytic thinker.
Yeah.
He tries to elevate chapter 5 of The Wretched of the Earth as the Fanon that we should be reading, the Fanon who warned about the corrosive effects of violence.
Hmm.
And in one of his LRB pieces, he likens this Fanon to Martin Luther King, which was a first for me. I had never seen, I mean,
Yeah.
was not the Fanon I recognized at all. And all of this was happening, Schatz's pieces, the biography, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, in a context where Palestinian radicals were trying to mobilize Fanon to argue for their liberation. And here you have a voice who is undermining, who is, with great
Absolutely.
sophistication, cutting the ground from under that attempt. And that troubled me too. So what I'm trying to, I guess Fanon is inescapable in this moment because he's being appropriated from all kinds of directions.
Yeah.
So then what do we do? I'm, of course, close reading is important and contextual reading is important, and I still want us to do all of those things. But I also argue that we need to relate to these figures less like trophies or cannot, uh, we need to engage in less of this sacral reading and in a more comradely reading
Yeah.
in which we are engaged with them in an argument, in which we don't set
Mm.
them up as oracles who have the answers to all possible questions,
Yeah.
but as ancestral figures who we take from, but also move beyond and move with. And so
Absolutely.
that's my interest in Fanon, and I don't claim to offer a definitive reading of the real
Sure.
Fanon, but
Yeah.
I want us to think about how
Hmm.
we read as much
Yeah.
as what we read.
Yeah.
And
And I
just to
think,
add a footnote to
sure.
that, I think Teltumbede's biography of Ambedkar, which I haven't finished reading, but I'm midway through, I think that's what he's trying to do with Ambedkar.
Yeah.
He's trying to desacralize him. He's trying to say that, we've put this figure up on, including the Dalit movement, has put this figure up on a pedestal, has iconized somebody who was himself an iconoclast, which
Yeah.
is paradoxical. So we're not being true to these figures when we engage in that kind of
Mhm.
sacralized reading. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think even if you're not saying something definitive, I think talking about Fanon's queer phobia, homophobia, and the elements of sexism that become apparent, and it's part also of a kind of attraction one feels towards him.
yeah,
And Adam Schatz's book, which you funnily say, too little rebel, too much clinic, or something like that. Which is absolutely accurate. I mean, it has done a lot of damage. It has felt almost personal to me how badly he has kind of diluted Fanon, or attempted to kind of extract him from the very theories that are so important to the world. And of course, that is related to his enduring Zionism, and his apologia for a sort of Zionist, cultural Zionism at least.
mhm,
So that's a huge issue. And then tagged on to that, two films have been released in France, and I don't know if they've made their way to the UK, but Jean-Claude Barny has made a biopic called Fanon, and has done a sort of similar gesture as Schatz, which is, there's a lot of inaccuracies in Schatz's book as well as in Barney's movies, like a lot of just historical errors. And also yeah, taking Algeria, erased Algeria
mhm,
from the film, which is very horrifying.
mhm,
So
mhm.
yeah, so I think it's sad because we're always left with either a canonization or a dilution. So
Yeah.
those seem to always be the options when it comes to important major thinkers who had their own flaws. And
Mhm,
um, Gandhi and Fanon are, of course, important to me. My book now, which is very old, I mean, it started with a chapter comparing the two
mhm.
of them and some of the fault lines in the way they thought. So I see your return to them as a forever return. I think
Mm.
we'll always be returning to these figures because there's so much we need to take also from them, at the end of the day. And currently with Palestine, it seems absolutely crucial. It's urgent
Yeah.
that we read some of these things, read against them, read past them, but engage with them somehow, read differently, I would say.
Yeah.
I want to ask you one final question. So I thought, I thought your book was, I'm not going to call it an easy read, but I would say that it's an academic book that's accessible, I would say. But I think for a very general reader, it would still be an academic book. Certainly, that's the style of citing and so on and so forth. But then you have this final, really moody chapter where you talk about falling in love. You talk about this island you find yourself on out in Scotland, and the chapter is called "We Are Here Because You Were There." Also enigmatic and beautiful. And you seem haunted by COVID, and there are all these excursions you take. And then suddenly we're also having a history of settler colonial Australia. It's a huge tonal shift. It was just a pleasure to read. So, where have we ended up now in this book? Or rather, why have you ended up there? I know it's not the end, but what's happening?
Yeah. Wow. You're basically asking me to tell the story of the last chapter. So I guess I'm a fan of the writer reflecting on the conditions within which the work was produced and being quite explicit about that. And a lot of this book was written during COVID, during different waves, different
Hmm.
rules. It was not at all the way I wrote my previous book, which had a lot of field work, a lot of international travel, a lot of interviews in person. That's my style. That's how I like to do this kind of work, and I really couldn't with this one. And through accident, life circumstances. As I say in the chapter, I fell in love with somebody who lives on the Isle of Mull, which is on the west coast, off the west coast of Scotland,
Yeah.
and ended up living there where I'm doing this interview from right now, and spending a lot of time, especially during COVID there. And it was a peculiar place to be in while working on this project because it felt very far away from all of these urban transnational sites that I was really interested in. So at one level, my heart sank because I thought there's this total incommensurability between where I am and what I'm trying to do and who I want to meet and all of that.
Hmm.
Um, but like everybody, I guess you make the best of circumstances. And so through sheer accident, I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised by this because everywhere in this country has colonialism just under the surface.
Yeah,
You just have to
truly.
scratch and you find it. And that's pretty much what I did. I discovered that I lived very close to the mausoleum of Lachlan Macquarie, who was the fifth governor of New South Wales, but really has this epic 18th, 19th century life, lived across multiple continents, American War of Independence, sometime in Jamaica, um,
Jeez.
a longish period in India,
Yeah.
in the East India Company Army, and then goes to New South Wales and is remembered to this day as the colonial builder of Sydney. So what I do in the book is, in that chapter, is to basically follow his life. Um, and I discover all these weird moments of bumping up against places I know
Yeah.
or moments in history that I also feel some connection to. So it's sort of an impressionistic, essayistic sort of meditation on
Lovely.
this figure and his afterlives. And what I'm trying to do in the chapter is not just tell my own story, but show how we can all tell our stories through these artifacts and objects that we are surrounded by.
Hmm.
We can tell our stories in and through and against the statues around us, so to speak.
Yeah.
Although in this case, it's a mausoleum. And I
Yeah.
guess I was also really inspired by a lot of Black feminist writing, people like Saidia Hartman, Hazel Carby, but also, um, um, Claudia Rankine, people who are writing across genres, right? This is history, this is literature, this is memoir, this is ethnography, it's autoethnography.
Yeah.
And I don't claim to have reached the level of any of these figures I've just mentioned, but that was the inspiration
Yeah.
for that
Yeah.
style of writing, which you're right, is a bit of an abrupt change of register. But I thought also that I wanted to jolt the reader into themselves.
Yeah.
Who are you? Where are
Hmm.
you? What's around
Yeah.
you?
I called it a tonal shift, very different from an abrupt change of register. I
Ah,
think
okay.
we still remain within that world, and I think it works really well. And I think it's of course worth taking the risk, right? I think it's worth risking. Writing about the personal can be very aggravating, can be very
Yeah.
vulnerable, but I think
Can be very navel gazy. That's the fear, right? That you want to do it to say something about more than just yourself. And
yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah,
I will say that I think it works. So I just want
thanks.
to thank you. That was it's a good note to end on. You've given us so much food for thought, and really, I've learned so much. Thank you for writing the book.
Thank you. Thanks. This is a great conversation.
Yeah.